All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Ingrid Timbo, and I am the Policy Director at the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. We're going to go ahead and get started with this webinar as soon as possible because we have a packed agenda, so we want to make sure that we reserve time at the end for question and answers. So the title of today's webinar is Are Forests Crucial to Reaching Our Climate Targets? This is presented on behalf of the Forest Water Champions Network. And this is actually number 2 in a series of 3 webinars that is being presented by the FWC. And because this one touches on the topic of climate change and specifically on national climate planning, we are proud to co-present this with the NDC Partnership. So first of all, I want to say to everyone, happy Earth Week. Of course, Earth Day is coming up this Thursday, the 22nd, but there's a number of events happening throughout the week, including this one. And later in the week, there will be a US-led Leaders Climate Summit. This is taking place on Thursday and Friday. And one of the key themes of this summit is addressing the role of nature-based solutions in achieving net zero by 2050. So very much aligned with the topic that we're covering today. Next slide, please. So before we dive in, I just want to let you know where we're headed over the next 75 minutes or so. After these introductory remarks, we are going to dive into NBS, or nature-based solutions, in the NDCs with Catherine Martini from the NDC Partnership. And then we are going to get into our panel discussion. We have a great panel of experts for you today, including 2 country level, national level speakers from Colombia and Rwanda talking about how their countries are integrating forests and water into their NDCs. And then we're going to look specifically at the project level with our partner from Peru, looking specifically at a project called Reconstrucción con Cambios, or reconstruction with changes. And then finally, look at the finance angle, right? So how can we better finance and also scale these types of projects for climate with the IDB. Following that, that's where you all come in. Please feel free to use the chat function at any time during this session to enter your questions. We will be monitoring that throughout, and they will be asked during that time. Following that, we will have some brief closing remarks from IUCN. One note of housekeeping: we are recording this webinar, so if you do not consent to taking part in the event, you can switch over to our Facebook live stream. I believe they're putting the link to that in the chat, where you can still watch the proceedings. You just won't be able to engage in the Q&A segment. So with that, next slide. Let's get into this. So the big question we're asking today: are forests crucial to reaching our climate targets? And there's actually kind of a corollary secondary question, I think, embedded in this as well. So if we agree that forests are crucial to reaching our climate targets, what are we doing to ensure that our forests have the resources they need to thrive under a changing climate? And so, for example, if we are investing in our forests, are we also investing in our watersheds? Because we know these systems are very much interlinked. So I would say, on behalf of the Forest Water Champions, obviously we feel very strongly that forests are crucial to reaching our climate targets. And that's all well and good, but what are the countries saying in their national climate plans? Next slide, please. So just a couple of months ago, the UNFCCC Secretariat put together a synthesis report of the updated 2020 NDCs that have been submitted thus far. And they looked at specific different adaptation priority areas and sectors. And you can see from this slide that terrestrial and wetland ecosystems are referenced in 90% of the updated NDCs that they'd received thus far. And of that, then forests are about 50%. And just below that are freshwater resources, which come in at almost 80% as well. So clearly forests and water are very much priorities for countries in adaptation, kind of at this very macro scale. But we also need to kind of dig into that a little bit deeper. And because we know that, if we are investing in tree planting afforestation, these types of projects, which could be very important for reducing urban heat islands or carbon capture and storage or coastal protection. Any alteration to the landscape can change the way that water flows both above and below ground. And so we aren't really going to know how those activities are impacting water unless we actually measure and monitor them. Next slide, please. And so this is where, oh, sorry, yep. Just go to the next one. So this is where this Forest Water Champions Network comes into play. So who are the Forest Water Champions? This is an expert network that was founded and is coordinated by FAO, IUCN, and CIWI, which is the Stockholm International Water Institute. And this group of experts advocates for better understanding of the forest-water nexus with a focus on interactions and consequences of forest-water interlinkages. As a group and also individually different members. So it's coordinated by FAO, IUCN, and CIWI, but there are multiple organizations such as my organization, AGUA, that are also involved. And we together have published several white papers and policy briefs in support of integrated forest water management. And currently we're supporting several activities under the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. So if you want more information about the Forest Water Champions, on the next slide, you'll see my colleague Malin's contact information at CIWI. You can get in touch with her to learn more. It's an open group, so they're always welcoming new members. So with that brief introduction, I want to turn it over to our first speaker, Catherine Martini, who is a senior country engagement specialist with the NDC Partnership. Her work involves helping countries with the revision and implementation of their NDCs. Catherine earned her Master's of Environmental Management degree from Yale and holds a BA in Political Science from the University of San Diego in California. So Catherine, the floor is yours.
Can you guys see my slides and hear me all right?
Yep, sounds
okay.
Great.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ingrid. So hi, thanks for having me. To kick off, I'm going to give a quick overview about nature-based solutions in the NDC partnership work. And my name is Catherine Martini. As you just heard, I'm a senior country engagement specialist with the NDC Partnership. I help countries develop implementation and enhancement plans for their revised NDCs, particularly with Antigua and Barbuda, Jamaica, Malawi, Eswatini, and Nauru. And before I dive in, I just want to give a special thanks to two of my colleagues who helped with the analysis in this report. So big thank you to Talia Chorover and Noah Magadishi. So with that, we'll dive right in. If I can advance them, here we go. So first, a little bit about what the NDC Partnership is. The NDC Partnership is a coalition of countries and institutions that are collaborating to drive transformational climate action while also enhancing sustainable development. So the NDC Partnership was created to help countries in supporting their implementation plans for their NDC contributions to the Paris Agreement. We're a membership-based organization currently comprised of about 114 countries, and then also 68 different member institutions broken across a couple different types. So we have international members such as the World Health, World Meteorological Organization, UN Habitat, African Union Commission, and then also a growing number of associate members, so nonprofits and NGOs like RARE or Greenhouse Gas Management Institute, Pew, etc. And the partnership really operates by matching country needs for climate mitigation and adaptation with support from international partners. So we'll receive requests from governments related to NDC implementation and enhancement and assist in coordinating the development of donor aid and fulfilling those requests. Ideally, reducing government transaction costs while empowering countries through a country-driven process. So I know most of you guys are here probably because you already know and understand and appreciate the vast power of nature-based solutions, but just a quick overview, there are so many other cross-cutting benefits from nature-based solutions. And we've got, habitats for wetlands, endangered species, improved water quality, carbon capture and storage, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, and they also really underpin the Sustainable Development Goals as well, which is wonderful. And if we're looking at the numbers that I had are from this first round of NDCs. I know Ingrid was showing kind of the updated synthesis report from the UNFCCC, and some countries are still actually working to get their next round of NDCs in. So if we're looking at in that first round, about 130 of 196 countries did include some kind of nature-based solution in their NDCs. However, there's definitely an opportunity for how countries can further include details on the scope and the process of how those actions are going to happen. So the challenge remains in how can nature-based solutions be included in country plans and climate that's detailed and measurable. So now we'll go into a few of the requests that NDC Partnership is seeing from countries on nature-based solutions. So when we look at the whole universe of requests that the partnership receives, nature-based solutions make up only about 5% of those. So it's a small but mighty percent. However, what is good is that the majority of that 5%, the majority of the nature-based solution requests that we see have current support from partners, which is great. And nature-based solution requests are coming from all different geographic regions that we work in. So further zooming in on kind of what's the sectoral breakdown of the nature-based solution requests that the partnership is seeing, and a majority of them unsurprisingly fall in the AFOLU category. About 53% of the requests are in the AFOLU category, which really highlights the opportunity for linkages with other sectors, kind of getting at that question that Ingrid brought up, like underneath, what about watersheds? Like if we're gonna have forests be successful in countries' climate action, what else and resources need to happen? And we can see from the kind of requests we get from the partnership that there's a big opportunity for those linkages and waste and energy and buildings and water. Looking now, kind of splitting it across adaptation and mitigation, there are 4 times as many requests for nature-based solutions in adaptation, of course. And finally, breaking it down across the kind of, what do these categorically, what's the meat and potatoes of these nature-based solution requests? Most of them really focus on budgeting and investment. So how can we get investment and budgeting opportunities to implement these things? Go through a couple quick country examples. So letting you know kind of what we might see from countries, what they're asking for. So for Albania, they've requested support for mainstreaming agroforestry as an alternative to the standard agricultural practices and carbon sequestration. So that request is currently not supported. It's open. Burkina Faso is reducing the vulnerability of natural resource dependent livelihoods by restoring the country's wetland ecosystem. Request that's supported in Pakistan by WWF is to monitor the impacts for forest activities, working on quantifying that carbon sequestration, and enhancing watershed management for biodiversity conservation. So this request actually came through the Climate Action Enhancement Package, which is a program from the NDC Partnership that specifically looks at enhancement of this next round of NDCs. Uganda has been strengthening its NDC by collecting baseline data around wetlands. That data is so crucial and important and very difficult to get. Countries often need assistance in that regard. And Jordan has a number of NBS activities as well around blue carbon, seagrasses, and incentive programs for permaculture and agriculture. So I briefly mentioned CAP, or the Climate Action Enhancement Package, and that we're seeing, what's one good thing about that is we're having an increased amount of NBS requests from countries in CAP, meaning that there's a little bit of hope in that, and that moving forward in this next round of NDCs, we'll ideally be seeing more nature-based solutions in those recovery plans. Right, so the conclusion and key takeaways I kind of already hinted at, but basically nature-based solutions are well supported by partners, the requests we're seeing. 2/3 of the requests for nature-based solutions are supported, even if they make up only a small amount of the total requests that the partnership is seeing. And there is that big opportunity moving forward to have a wider linkage across different sectoral breakouts, like water, like energy, buildings, and breaking out of that AFOLU sector. The other thing we notice is that countries aren't really requesting as much M&E support for NBS. So this is another good opportunity for organizations working with countries or government officials to think about, how are we really going to implement this and track it and measure it? And then again, under the CAP or Climate Action Enhancement Package, looking at helping countries with the enhancement and revision of their next round of NDCs, we are seeing more stronger focus in NBS there, which is great. So that's something to keep an eye out for. And with that, a big thank you and a thank you to my colleagues, and I'll hand it on over.
Thank you, Catherine, so much. Really interesting to note, kind of the big interest kind of overarching in the first round of NDCs in NBS, but then only 28% including that kind of detailed scope. So I've been looking at with a lot of interest into some of the new NDCs that have coming through, and I think we are seeing a greater level of attention to kind of the details, but definitely we've got a ways to go there. So with that really great overview, we're going to switch to hear from the countries themselves on what they're doing. So I'm really excited to introduce our first panelist, Kirsty Lopez, who is an NBS technical expert in the Colombian Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development within the Climate Change and Risk Management Directorate. She is an environmental and sanitary engineer by training and a specialist in environmental and local development with over 5 years experience in environmental management and an emphasis on climate change adaptation in the public sector. So welcome, Kirsty, and the floor is yours. Kirsty, if you're speaking, we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Hey,
yeah, there you
go. Thanks for everyone to join in this important webinar. I'm Kirsty Lopez, and I work at Ministry of Environmental and Sustainable Development. My presentation is about the update of the Colombian nationally determined contribution. This process started in 2019 with the approbation of the roadmap of the update of the NDC. We achieved the guidance by the principles of the Paris Agreement, and Colombia communicate this update and enhance the NDC in December in 2020. We commit to reduce by 51 our greenhouse emissions expected for 2030, and this NDC include quality and quantitative greenhouse emissions measured for a total of 148 measures, 32 national measures, 3 measures in black carbon, 24 measures led by private sector, and 89 territorial measures. The NDC of Colombia not only states general goals, but also includes in detail 200 actions through which will achieve our objectives, which were the result of joint and participatory process. For each of those actions, we indicate which are the entity responsibility for their implementation, activities, milestones, indicators, and their relationship with the Sustainable Development Goals. For the adaptation, considering the vulnerability of our country, where climate change is a matter of survival, we have established a comprehensive set of adaptation and risk management goals, and it's why we are the first country to include in our NDC the first communication and adaptation on climate change. This this communication reflects our needs and priorities for support required with respect to technology development and transfer, capacity buildings, and financial. It's contained 30 adaptation goals in 5, such as ecosystems, conservation and protection, planning and implementation, and information management. our NDC was built in joint manner with multiple stakeholders, around 110 entities in the public sector and private sector. And Colombia is fully committed with the climate neutrality and is working on the NDC implementation plan with a roadmap of work for all relevant stakeholders. We know that the concept of the nature-based solution has many different definitions, and we don't have a consensus. But however, nature-based solution approach are in different instruments, such as NDC, in fact, in the targets about ecosystem conservation and protection, and in the integral climate plan environment sector, we identify in one of the strategy lines as nature-based solution. That's really important to work in this field. And I would like to note that one project important for Colombia, and I need to have some context about the hydropower in Colombia. About 50 and 85% of our country electricity mix in hydropower. A healthy forest cover in upland waters is essential to maintain established hydrologic and develop firm energy. However, climate change will affect temperatures and rainfall patterns that they're key for stable water and energy supply in these countries. For the reasons we work in this project, nature-based solution adaptation for hydropower in Colombia, the objectives are in this project present a business case for hydropower oriented to ecosystem-based adaptation, identify opportunity to create economic incentive, and develop a national information system to monitor progress and results, and develop a roadmap for public and private actors to reply. And why work in adaptation through natural infrastructure? Because we think that this approach produces dry season water, reduce landslides and flood risk, purify water, engage communities and support sustainable rural livelihoods, and sequester carbon and regulate climate. And in this project, the participants are Ministry of Environmental and Sustainable Development, Ministry of Mining and Energy, WRI, Conservation International, and ACOLGEN. And ACOLGEN is a Colombian Hydropower Industry Association. And my last slide is about how to support national climate commitment. And it's because thus resilience and low carbon hydropower provides a new financial instrument to achieve mitigation and adaptation goals, and restore vulnerable ecosystem, and support ecosystem dependent communities in sustainable landscapes management.
Thank you, Kirsty. Really great presentation, and I especially am really interested in the project that you mentioned at the end, because it really highlights something we talk about a lot with nature-based solutions in terms of providing multiple benefits. And so this is an example, the Sustainable Hydropower Project, that actually has benefits for potentially for mitigation and for adaptation. And that's something we don't often hear about. I know Catherine in her opening segment talked about how a lot of the NBS that we're seeing so far is oriented much more towards adaptation, but that there are also really great potential mitigation benefits as well. So thank you so much. Just a reminder to everyone, if you have any questions, you can always put them in the chat, and we will get to them during the Q&A segment. So next up, I would like to introduce Musana Segategara Bernard, who is the head of knowledge and forecasting at Rwanda's Water Resources Board. He holds a Master of Science degree in geoinformatics and Earth observation for watershed management and modeling, and has worked for over 17 years in sustainable land management in Rwanda. Musana, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm happy to be part of this interesting and very high-level panel, and to share with you what is the Water Resources Board, how it interacts with this topic. Briefly, I'll talk about the sector and, as my predecessor, about the target and the NDC of my country, and a bit also on hydroelectricity, as she did, but and then diving into some of the NBS we've been working on. So briefly, the NDC, if you look at AFOLU, what we call here just agriculture, it's about a potential of reducing by 2.2 if we have the right practices, million CO2. And then if we dive into that, sector, we'll see that more than half of it will benefit from having an investment in agroforestry, in tree planting, in forestry, on biomass increase in the system. We also benefit from this initiative, from the NDC implementation, from the MRV thinking about how we are going to monitor and report the NC. We had an early investment on improving the monitoring of particularly some of the MBS we have that respond to erosion control. And you see most of our, in Rwanda, because of the steep slope, we talk a lot about bench terraces, terracing. But if you look at all other measures that are recommended, most of them are related to tree planting or NBS. And in fact, currently, forestry plays the biggest role in conserving our watershed and water resources. So if you look at electricity or energy sector, the biggest share is hydropower. While if we are looking at countries like Rwanda with high population density, more than 50% of the land cultivated, the result of having a storage or an hydropower plant is that most of the time you have a high risk of having a sediment load. So through the support of the Netherlands Embassy and the support of USAID, we conducted a pilot study that have been able to show which part of the watershed, like in this case is Nyabarongo watershed, one of the tributary of Akagera going to Lake Victoria, you can map which watersheds are very in critical stages, critical states. And here, particularly for this dam, there's a catchment where there's a mining activity which creates a lot of sediment. So with that, we've turned our monitoring of watershed, of catchment into plans. And as you say, it's very important. If you want to increase, we have just developed only less than 30% of our catchment, our storage capacity, meaning also our hydropower capacity. And if you want to maximize, it's very important to tie the water resource development and the storage development, hydropower with natural-based solution. And this being a problem, I think is also, if you look at it carefully, the example of the dam I was presenting become an opportunity to demonstrate why most of the storage are just loaned from the government, and it's a heavy investment. And after the road, I think those can be road construction. Big investment in water are really coming second in terms of investment, at least in our country. And that means it's become an opportunity to have a high-level discussion on how natural-based solutions should be top in the agenda if we want to maximize the benefit from our other investments. So those investment plans are really articulated around our National Water Resources Master Plan. We have also a couple of other instruments like the one I presented earlier, which is the Catchment Restoration Opportunity Map, where with the NDC support, we have been able to turn that into a dashboard where any user can set his own area of interest and look at what are the measures already in place and what is the gap in terms of measures. And in the case of the presentation I show, the slide I presented earlier, it was only like less than 30% of the desired measures that are in place currently. So moving to action now. So we have the plans, and the board is about turning the catchment plan into action, looking at investment, appropriate investment mechanisms for turning the plans we have for catchments into action. So the board is quite a new structure in the Rwanda landscape, and mainly in charge of flood and erosion control. I'll just giving some example, like with flood control in the volcano, nice place, but very high risk. And this is not only gray infrastructure, but also green infrastructure that comes in. And we also have upstream measures with trees and forests being the part of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Musana, for that presentation and a really good overview of some of the work that Rwanda is doing. And especially there right at the end, highlighting the important role of hybrid infrastructure. So we want to make sure when we're talking about nature-based solutions, right, not necessarily everything. We're not saying throw out gray infrastructure entirely, right? Most of what we're talking about is actually taking hybrid approaches. So thank you for highlighting that. And so from the kind of national level, we're gonna take it down a little bit and look at a specific project that is currently being developed in Peru. So next up we have Jenna Gami, who is the Deputy Chief of Party in Natural Infrastructure for Water Security Project with the organization Forest Trends based in Peru. This project is a unique one working to catalyze investments by the public and private sectors in the conservation and restoration of ecosystems and indigenous practices in order to manage water risks. Prior to this project, Jenna led the first assessment of the cost effectiveness of green infrastructure for Lima's water supply and contributed to Forest Trends' efforts to scale up watershed investments in China, Bolivia, Mexico, Ghana, and Brazil. Jenna holds a Master's of Science with distinction in Environmental Policy and Regulation from the London School of Economics. Jenna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ingrid. Good morning, everybody. So let's get to it. As Ingrid mentioned, Just to give a bit of background, I helped to lead a project called Natural Infrastructure for Water Security in Peru. We started in December 2017. It's a 5-year project funded by U.S. Agency for International Development and the Canadian government. Forestry leads the project implementation with our partners Condesan, the Peruvian Society for Environmental Law, Ecodecisión, and Imperial College London. And what we aim to do with our project is facilitate the acceleration and scaling up of investments in nature, including forests, but also looking at other ecosystems like wetlands and grasslands, and also looking at indigenous technologies, especially in the Peruvian context, that support those ecosystems and support recovering and maintaining watershed services, all with a focus to managing specific water risks. So what I'm going to talk about today is some work that we've been doing for a few years to support a national program called Reconstrucción con Cambios, translates to reconstruction with changes, sort of the original Building Back Better, perhaps, I'm not sure, to incorporate investments in nature with a large emphasis on investments in forests. So what I want to highlight here to start, and you can see with my background, I have a glorious polylepsis tree, which is a very distinctive native tree in Peruvian dry forest. Other landscapes that we're working in look like this, or they look like this. Montane forests. What we're working in particularly though for Reconstrucción con Cambios, and I'll explain this a little bit in a second, is we're working on coastal watersheds that are steep Andean context that flow into one of the driest deserts in the world. And so we're talking in this particular context about types of forests that can complement maybe what we would first think of when we think about nature-based solutions for climate and forests. I tend to think, especially about Amazon and other rainforests, but there's also really significant opportunities in drier contexts. So here's a snapshot of where we're at with the Reconstrucción con Cambios program, which I think is an extraordinary story about actually scaling and accelerating investments in nature-based solutions. So right now, this program, which was set up in order to manage climate risks of floods and landslides, has developed a portfolio of $243 million worth of investments in nature-based solutions, of which 17.6 million have been approved in the kind of project design stage and are moving towards final work plan towards implementation later this year. Another 225 million are in the pipeline. We're expecting approvals to happen in the next few months. So these are rather mature projects that we estimate will result in over 45,000 hectares of reforestation, over 8,000 full-time job equivalents developed over the course of their implementation in 4 years, and over 3 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent sequestered. And the plans are these investments are all designed in conjunction with other gray infrastructure investments in order to increase the resilience of vulnerable watersheds in Peruvian coast, particularly looking towards reducing the exposure, vulnerability of those critical populations and infrastructure in those watersheds to floods and landslides. The program, Reconstrucción con Cambios, was set up after significant floods and landslides in 2017 called the El Niño Costero, significant damages that I summarized here, particularly in Peru's coastal watersheds, was really a horrible string of events, and one that repeated other similar events that had happened historically as a result of the El Niño phenomenon in Peru. And so as a result, the Peruvian government created this large national program called Reconstrucción con Cambios that has a total budget of about 7 billion, of which about 1.5 billion was allocated not to just recovering infrastructure that was damaged in those slides, but also really rebuilding and reinvesting in the watersheds that were affected by these events in order to increase their resilience. So those plans that aim to increase the resilience are called integrated solutions. And the kind of initial policy that set up what those integrated solutions should be composed of said very succinctly riparian defenses, flood control dams, and kind of a mixed bag third part that included natural infrastructure as well as other things like capacity building and early alert systems. But what we saw, what happened in this case and what happens in other cases is that we have a really ambitious and visionary policy that includes at a very simple scale, you must do natural infrastructure focus, include forests, include this way of thinking about solutions to solve this problem. But when that gets to the agency in charge to implement or the engineering companies that are hired to develop the plans, there isn't the capacity, the technical frameworks, the tools, everything that's needed to actually implement that. So one of the key messages that I want to share today is that when we think about actually accelerating action on nature-based solutions, we have to think about how we're going to build a robust project pipeline. We need the financing, we need that to be based off of policy, but we need to implement it with a robust pipeline. And there's often a huge gap there. So we worked on something I'm interested in exchanging with our colleagues from Rwanda. We developed an innovative tool that we call HERO to identify rapidly priority areas for investments. We developed training materials, conceptual frameworks to train specialists from the engineering companies who are developing the plans and the government agencies that were in charge with overseeing their development. We now have this portfolio of investment underway with a number of different actors, and we're supporting also getting to monitoring and adaptive management. So just to close, I know we're short on time. What I would say from Peru, what we could think about in terms of lessons and policy at the international level is that initial policy push to include specifically nature-based solutions as something that must be at least considered, if not actually included in strategies to address water and climate risks, especially when you're talking about solutions that are developed by some of these other sectors. It creates an enormous kind of opening to be able to work on these issues, but the policy needs to be flexible enough for technical specialists to be able to design nature-based solutions that will work for that sector. And then to be able to do that, there are a series of capacities, tools, frameworks that need to be developed. And that's a role there that filling those gaps is an area where international cooperation and civil society can play a really critical role. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jenna, for that, and for including those kind of key messages at the end. I think, yeah, really important, the concept of policy flexibility, especially because we know that not all NBS are appropriate for every context, right? And so, and also they are designed to be adaptive over time. So there may need to be adjustments that are made. And so we need the space and the capacity to be able to make those adjustments. And then also calling out the need for robust project pipelines. And so hopefully that might be something that our next speaker also touches on. So next up, to close out the panel discussion, we have Gregory Watson, who is the lead specialist for the Natural Capital Lab Initiative at the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank. He currently leads the IDB's biodiversity cluster and the Natural Capital Lab, which I mentioned, which is funded with $44 million from the governments of France and the UK. This lab serves as a one-stop shop for the IDB group and partners to drive innovation in natural capital finance. It works to incubate, accelerate, and scale new solutions to pressing problems by looking at nature as an asset. And Greg also leads the IDB's effort to mainstream biodiversity across the bank and the countries with which they work. So Greg, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ingrid. And I'm going to be a bit of a rebel. I don't have slides, so you're just going to be looking at me while I speak. But I didn't pay Jenna to end the way she did, but I'm glad that she did because it links very well with what I was going to talk about. And like we said in the introduction, at the IDB, we're really shifting a focus to looking at how nature-based solutions and biodiversity can be seen as an asset. The Dasgupta review did a lot of interesting work on that. And within countries, we're also trying to make that argument. And it's really a shift in the way that we talk about these topics and the way that we present this to both public and private sector stakeholders. If we're looking at finance in this sector, we need to look at both public and private sources. And it's unrealistic to think that we're going to get there with Ministry of Environment and Conservation budgets. We need to be mainstreaming this topic across a whole of government approach so that we're carving out pieces of the infrastructure budget or the water budget. And that's a complex thing to do. So, if you ask me, what are we looking at in terms of how do we finance this? It's mainstreaming, it's innovation and tools to spark some new ideas, and it's blended finance. I'll start with the mainstreaming piece. At the bank, we're actually working to mainstream these topics across everything that we do. And so we've just approved last year a request that we create a natural capital and biodiversity action plan that will basically say how we're going to do this with all of our sectors, and so that this is a cross-cutting topic with our capital markets team, our social teams, our health teams, and our infrastructure teams and all around the bank. That's something that my team's working on now. But also in parallel to that, when you look at the programming of a large MDB that's going to be, putting vast sums of money into different kinds of projects in partnership with the government, that programming cycle starts way, 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 way back. And so within an MDB, we have these things called country development challenges, country strategies, that are the dialogue with the government when a new government takes office, that will set the priorities for all of the spending. And so similarly to the way that we have in the past mainstream climate, we're now starting that process with biodiversity and natural capital. And a key part of that obviously is nature-based solutions. And what that means is, identifying in the country the intersection between NDC priorities, biodiversity strategies and action plans, COVID recovery strategies, infrastructure plans, to find those win-win-win projects where $1 can have multiple impacts. Also, it means making smart value cases that speak the language of the sector. So I think while most of us who are here in this event kind of understand the complexities of why these nature-based solutions make sense, I think when you're speaking to a infrastructure specialist or a capital market specialist or a Ministry of Finance, which I think is one of the key players for this space, you need to meet them where they are, and you need to be able to come to them with the arguments that speak to their objective and maybe not lead with the nature first agenda. It's more, let me show you what nature can do for you. So we're in the process of doing that in 15 countries right now. Actually, WRI and Suzanne's team is supporting us in that work. And we hope that that will provide the base for, upscaling of this in the future. That doesn't mean we haven't done a lot already. We, have a sustainable infrastructure program that's been working on this for quite some time and a number of projects on the ground, but doing it in a systematic way. We also support countries with this work. So, in the case of Colombia, we're supporting the Ministry of Planning in this kind of mapping of opportunities and projects. And in Costa Rica, we actually supported the creation of the Blue Economy Recovery Strategy, which includes a number of potential projects that are related to nature-based solutions. Many of them with mangrove ecosystems, but some of them also more traditional onshore forestry projects. Also, I guess if we were to talk a bit about some of the research agenda and the tools that we look at, we're about to issue some more papers. We've issued some in the past where we interviewed scores of infrastructure developers, planners, to find out why are these topics and why are these solutions not being upscaled as much as we thought. Basically, it's the same story. We need to prioritize this at the upstream level, meaning budget planning and prioritization, sectoral planning, new regulations and construction codes, and also the procurement and tender process. Can we, include in there requirements that NVS are looked at, and can we support the development of those in countries? It's also important for us to track data on what's worked and what hasn't, and we need to demonstrate performance metrics and proof of concept. So, ongoing performance monitoring and funding for that monitoring and evaluation has to be allocated upfront. And so that's a kind of a practice that we are starting to work into our projects as well. And then on the financial markets, green is the buzzword of the day. We surveyed 161 asset owners, asset managers, and financial intermediaries. And they've said that, they see this as a priority area. But what they need is a set of tools that allow them to create the cost-benefit scenarios that can help them make the arguments for their own decision makers in this process, because governments need to capitalize on this trend and create strategies to create a bankable pipeline to do this work. And for example, utilities and municipalities can issue green bonds using contracted cash flows from ratepayers or taxpayers. There's the case of the Central Arkansas Green Bond, which some of you may know. It was the first water utility to issue the first ever green bond to protect forest lands for water quality. And it shows the revenue generating capacity of NBS that can provide an upside to the project developer. The utility's $31.8 million bond estimates allocating 33% for finance forest acquisition and 66% for traditional infrastructure. And as we can start to get more of those cases into the regular discussions that we as MDBs have with banks, I think we can spur more finance. And then finally, just I think speaking as an MDB and also in the research we did, MDBs are really key. We analyzed 100 NBS case studies with Suzanne's team, and all of them received some technical support and or grant funding, meaning that financing this innovation in infrastructure takes partners. And so we need wide partners to underwrite this kind of work. There's an example we're working on right now. It's not forests, but creating insurance products for coral reefs as natural infrastructure, where we need to provide a little bit of risk capital up front, either in research or convertible debt that or quasi-equity that allow these kind of new concepts and new ideas to have a runway to take flight so that we can scale them in the future. So I think I'll stop there, and I have some examples that maybe we can talk about in the questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Greg. And yeah, looking forward to hearing about some specific examples, but really great to highlight the whole of government kind of approach that's really needed, and also the critical role that we're hearing more and more about in terms of blended finance opportunities, and also the need for ongoing performance monitoring. That kind of calls back to something Catherine mentioned kind of in the opening segment, that M&E actually has been, at least in the past, kind of a lower priority. So that's somewhere that we need to be looking at increasing awareness and investment there as well. So I would just want to give a big thank you to all of our panelists for their great presentations. And I will now be turning the discussion over to Suzanne Osment, a Senior Associate for Natural Infrastructure at WRI, who's going to lead us through the remaining Q&A portion. So again, remember, any questions that you have, please feel free to put them in the chat now. Suzanne, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Ingrid. Hi, everyone. I'm Suzanne Osment from the World Resources Institute, and I'm delighted to get this conversation started between our audience and our wonderful lineup of speakers. If you have any questions, now is the time to enter it into the chat. And to kick it off, I will take the to ask my own question as others continue to add theirs to the chat. First of all, may I ask that the speakers please go ahead and turn on your cameras. You're not required to respond to any questions that you don't want to, but that just might streamline the process for us going forward. Thanks. This is an open question for any of the speakers who would like to respond. I'd like to sort of dig into national and subnational dynamics for a minute. All the speakers alluded to the fact that nature-based solutions is site-specific and therefore presumably requires some form of subnational leadership. But Jenna's presentation brought into focus, as she spoke about the disconnect between ambitious policy and the lack of the pipeline on the ground. I think Greg also touched on this, but I'd like to hear from everyone. What do you consider the importance of national and subnational coordination to leverage nature-based solutions to achieve our climate commitments, and how can we better connect these two scales? Who would like to kick it off? Greg?
Just because I didn't see any other hands go up immediately, but maybe I can talk about two examples that I see as really interesting. So the bank is supporting two projects, one in Colombia, one in Panama, and both of them have these kind of dual level kind of planning processes where you have maybe the national government setting up, for example, in Colombia, the concept of biodiverse cities, but then you have the city of Barranquilla looking at how do we integrate nature-based solutions into our city development plan and into our bioeconomy and the restoration of large segments of in that case, it's a mangrove ecosystem. And then, I think a better case even to talk about is in Panama, where we have a project with, and it goes to what I was saying about creating different audiences, right? The Audubon Society is actually the executing agency working with the municipality of Panama City and the Ministry of Environment to support mangrove inclusion into the NDC. And we're looking at all of the benefits to the airport in terms of resilience, the benefits to various different private sector landholders, water treatment, low-income populations that depend on their livelihoods. And when you aggregate a coalition like that with municipal leaders, they're really able to push to affect change at the national level and also create these financing vehicles to support the changes you're trying to make that incorporate all of those actors. And so I think that, those are kind of best practices for me in terms of being able to identify the case that makes resonance with each of those different actors.
Musana.
Yeah, thank you. I think my experience that most of the initiatives are either strong in national level planning and or local level. It's always hard to get the balance between the two in the implementation kind of journey. But I have a small theory that you need a skeleton for the country, and that's difficult to get from a local level. But the flesh and all around the bone should be local, because otherwise it's very tough to. So that's my simple answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg and Musana. Anyone else like to chime in, or should we move on? Okay. We've got a few questions rolling in now, so we'll continue then. The next question I'd like to ask is around the timeline of nature-based solutions and the urgent climate crisis facing us. Johanna from the audience has asked, how can we enhance the use of nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation when the timeline for reaping the rewards through nature-based solutions can be a longer-term time frame than reducing carbon emissions from industry? And I do think that's a great question. It doesn't only apply to mitigation, but there's also complexity in managing the timelines around nature-based solutions for adaptation as well, some complexity and uncertainty there. So I'd like to hear if any of the speakers have some remarks on that.
I'm happy to jump in quickly. I think it sort of touches on the last topic about mainstreaming. I think it's super important for these types of policies and projects to get into countries' medium-term and long-term development strategies. Without that, the kind of exactly what you talked about in terms of issues with time horizons won't get addressed. But I think it's not just nature-based solutions that have a longer time horizon, but sometimes really large infrastructure projects as well. So I think it's kind of a confluence of all of the above, right? So a little bit on that previous question, to be a member of the NDC Partnership, we get to have focal points in both the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Environment, knowing that one or the other can't do it. I think Greg really targeted on that, being able to talk to different stakeholders in their own language and their own heuristic, whether that be about gray solutions or a financier or somebody from a different ministry, how important that is. But the same thing goes for downscaling at the local government where projects are going to be implemented. But I would say that same kind of concept applies for these projects that require longer time horizons and getting them into these medium-term and longer-term development strategies. I think a lot of that coordination work is something that can often slip through the cracks. It can be really difficult, and somebody has to manage that. Somebody has to be making points of contact across sectors, across different ministries. And if there isn't somebody designated with time in their TOR for that, a lot of times it doesn't happen. So that's one of the things we try to do with countries in NDC Partnership, is ensure that the countries we work with have a designated coordinator person who does this, who does the bilateral phone calls, who's kind of responsible for these things not slipping through the cracks. Otherwise, just like I'm sure you or me, if it's not in my TOR, a lot of times it gets pushed, unfortunately. Thanks.
Great, Catherine. And that kind of doubles down on some points that Greg had mentioned as well about how we need to bake this in at the earliest stages of planning. And I think it actually is a perfect entree to questions that we got from Lotta and Albert as well in the audience. And this is around how to mainstream some of these approaches across other countries. So, you know, despite the fact there were some examples, wonderful examples provided, Catherine, your presentation highlighted that, especially around nature-based solutions in water, which is one of the main focuses of this discussion, I think there were only 12% that had been identified in the NDCP review you had presented. So why do the panelists think that is? Are we fully tapping this nexus already, or is there, I assume there's a need for further mainstreaming, further expansion, right? I think that's a message that's come across. So what advice do you have to other countries to take advantage of nature-based solutions to achieve climate commitments? And this is a two-parter. I'll also ask you, well, how aware do you think the administrations and financiers that are relevant to this space, how aware are they of nature-based solutions? Are we still in the phase where we need to sell this concept, explain this concept, or are we past that yet? Who'd like to kick it off?
I'll jump in just quickly. I think that generally in the field, we've done a lot of work to build a lot of awareness, especially in the space where we're defining NDCs. I think whether or not the NDCs are going to be implemented depends a lot on what Greg mentioned, which is whether the sectors who need to be responsible for financing and leading the implementation believe in it, whether they think it's plausible, whether they think it's going to solve their problems. And so I think we need to really take a problem solving, solutions oriented approach, which seems like it's, you know, implicit in the name or clear, explicit in the name, nature-based solutions. But a lot of times we focus so much on the co-benefits that we're not actually focusing on how are we solving your problem in the context of ambitious, you know, climate action. We're really not looking at a problem in the next 5 years to speak to the other point about the, you know, short-term needs, but really looking at, okay, on a 20-year, 30-year horizon, what are we expecting? How do we build in the resilience? There will definitely be a role for nature-based solutions with that sort of vision, but it needs to be designed in order to solve problems on a local and regional scale, and that makes sense for each sector. So I think that it's important to include the nature-based solutions in the NDCs. I think if you can include language that sort of like starts a process and starts a conversation with those sectors, it can be really valuable, but we should focus on actually making the cases to those sectors where they are. And I think some of the cases that we talked about today are doing a really interesting job of that. And then I think what we can't forget about is where we have made progress on making the case. And we have some leaders from these sectors who are really champions, sticking their neck out and saying, yeah, I'm going to do that. I'm going to lead the way. We need to support them to actually get to implementation, to monitor, to do adaptive management, because those cases can serve as examples to the rest of the world that then can follow. And if those cases can't get to implementation and can actually do what we, you know, this kind of realize this potential that we all see, then I think we're going to have trouble continuing to make the case to other sectors that might be skeptical because they don't see how does it actually work. So I think getting that practical experience and making sure that we're focusing on making the case, mainstreaming to the sectors, but we're also following through. And then when we have real examples, especially at scale, beyond like the pilot stage, but really at scale, that we're using opportunities like this to share them and to bring them to other sectors and really kind of spreading the good news.
That's great, Jenna. And I do agree, it's going to be a transformative moment when we have those projects at scale. I think that's how you're going to get buy-in, right? So excellent points. And I saw some heads nodding among the other speakers. Would anybody like to chime in with another perspective?
Yeah, I think it's good to sell to the sector, but I think also we need to, I noticed a small frustration a little bit. When we talk about agroforestry, for instance, and people, when you want to evaluate in the national communications about the impact, there's no MRFB appropriate to value the effort of NBS. Most of the NBS are even not accounted in the AFOLU framework, meaning that we may contradict ourselves. Tell people go for NBS, and then when they do NBS, we say this is not account. You need to have 100 hectares of forest to be accounted as a contribution. I think we need to be we need to leverage on the motivation and the momentum of the sector.
That's a great point. And it takes some foresight to think about what to include sort of at the policy and framework level and how it's going to filter down to the project level. That's a great point. With only 5, oh, please go ahead, Kirsty.
That we need to know the needs of identify the best way to reduce the impacts of climate change. And I think that we see the nature-based solution is one of the way to achieve these the goals under the Paris Agreement. And I think that the countries need to have a strong institutional agreement that allow to work in articulate manage with the territories. And I think that is a good way to achieve the goals and yeah, that's it.
That's a great point. And it actually is a perfect segue to another question that we received. And for sake of time, with about 4 minutes remaining before we wrap up, I'll cluster these 2 questions together. I hope that's okay. I'd like to talk a little bit about the role of civil society and communities in these projects. Some questions we received were about what are the tools available for civil society to help build enabling conditions, for example, like a strong institutional framework, as well as how do we integrate communities into these projects? So those are going to be the final 2 questions. I'd love to hear from as many speakers as we can with the short amount of time we have. So who'd like to respond? Greg.
I'll be really short, but I think that it goes back to what I was saying before. I mean, what I see, for example, in our case in Panama is we are working with fishing cooperatives and populations that live on the coast, and they're making their needs front and center in the discussions with all actors and saying, look, this is our livelihoods and this is our flood control for our homes, right? And I think that's something that civil society really could do even more of, which is link up with maybe someone they wouldn't usually work with, which is the large infrastructure provider, right? But when you can create those joint cases, I think it's even stronger, because then the person at the government who cares about infrastructure is going to listen, but so are the people who are looking at these other social benefits, and that's how we're going to make that shift at the government. In the private sector side, 2 things are going to shift: money and time, right? And so if you can save money in a project, or a project can happen more quickly, or live for a longer period of time, that's going to shift the discussion with the private sector. And so in as much as civil society can help make those cases and make those links for that segment too.
Fantastic. And I think of Forest Trends as an example where that's happened. Jenna, you have something to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add, we have on our website, it's mostly in Spanish, but we have a number of tools. If you look at our toolbox or caja de herramientas on our website for our natural infrastructure project, TNC also has a great toolbox for water funds. There are a number of tools out there. It might be interesting to put something together for where people can look at. But I mean, we're still refining this, but kind of a main lesson from our work is that you want to get to a point where you're soliciting ideas for projects from communities who would implement them. But there's a challenge in setting expectations clearly to make sure that those ideas and proposals are going to solve the problem that you're trying to solve. Because a lot of the ideas that might come up are very interesting ideas and might be really good at the local level, but aren't really going to respond to, your landslide risk or your water scarcity risk or your water quality risk, because a lot of that depends. I'm thinking very much with the water hat. A lot of that depends on where are you in the watershed, right? How much does it rain there? What's the slope there? What types of interventions would make sense that would respond to my indicator, and then how cost effective is that? So I think I wouldn't advocate going down a road where it's fully assessment, like reverse auction assessment on cost effectiveness against an indicator, because I think that a lot of the capacities aren't really there yet. But I think there has to be a way of, in a particular watershed, laying out really what the needs are, what are the risks, what are the indicators to address that, and what are kind of the interventions at the landscape scale that will be familiar to local communities in particular areas that would be of interest, and then soliciting those ideas and developing projects with those communities. But I think there's kind of like there needs kind of like this skeleton that Musano was talking about. There needs to be enough clarity to be able to direct the project, and then to invite innovation and kind of participation to solve the problem that will be able to be funded. Again, like being realistic about the expectations, and how do we be as constructive as possible in a way that's going to get us as quickly as possible to implementing something valuable to everybody involved.
Great, thanks, Jenna. And anyone would like to have the final word with 1 minute remaining before we turn it for wrap up?
Yeah, thank you. Just to say something, what the community wants, they want support, but they can also be opportunistic. So we have to be careful. So as any actors, we need to be, and there's a trade-off between more financing and more participation. And the sweet spot is an engineering you have to explore.
Yeah, excellent point. Okay, well, thank you all so much for the active conversation. I wish we had more time to dig in, but this has been very helpful, very enlightening. And now it's time for us to wrap up the webinar. So for that, I'll like to hand it off to James Dalton, the Director of the Global Water Program at IUCN. James.
Great, thank you, Suzanne, and thank you very much to the panelists and to the audience for some great questions. Just trying to pull that together demonstrates, I think, so far, very optimistic and a level of success around nature-based solutions and climate integration. If we look at what's been sort of talked about across the spread of countries, we're looking at diversifying our solutions, because I think we're seeing problems at that much broader scale and the interlinkages with them. And I think certainly, you know, looking at what we've heard from Colombia, looking at what we've heard from the NDC Partnership and from Rwanda, we're looking at restoring system function, and we're trying to break out of many of the frameworks that have been developed that probably don't do what we need them to do right now. And one of those may be a follow, but there are plenty of others. The integration with infrastructure, hydropower, but also agriculture as sectors that can make things happen. They come with investment, but they also operate under quite structured frameworks. And I think more broadly, nature-based solutions hasn't had to date, but we are demonstrating that we're thinking different, and we're trying to think more holistically across sectors. I think also, though, one of the points that Jenna raised is that, you know, to get the change that we want to see, we must start thinking about the policy buy-in now. We must get things happening now based on the experience we've got to date. And we need more experience, of course. We need to get that broader scale for the buy-in that we need. But the more that we're influencing now, the better we can set things on the right trajectory going forward for the next 20, 30 years. There is this need to have dedicated people and possibly dedicated institutions and dedicated regulatory change that can be the brokers between these different sectors of forestry, water, engineering, whatever it may be, holistically pull things together. And I think, therefore, one of the links, and you know, as the forest water champions looking at this relationship between forest and water, this nexus, is to try and match the solution providers to the problem holders at the country level and internationally, to ensure that those options are put forward for people to consider in their new planning options going forward for climate or for their particular sectoral interest. So we have tools, but there is a need potentially for new tools to be developed that are a little bit broader than perhaps your standard cost-benefit analysis or your return on investment thinking, which is very sectoral and very project-wise, but new frameworks that can really think more broadly across overall landscape change. And that brings out the opportunity to pull in more participation from different sectors, more participation from different financiers and investors as well. And that helps us attract scale finance. So I think there's huge optimistic possibilities there, and some great success stories already from across the countries and from the partnerships that have been presented. So I just want to thank you very, very much for your time. Thank you again to our panelists and our presenters for their excellent commitment to this session and to your great presentations. Thank you to the audience for the great questions, and please do pay attention for the next session. In early June, we'll be having the next Forest Water Champions meeting, which will be focused on agroforestry. So keep an eye out for that. We'll be advertising that on the different websites and through social media. And finally, just a big thank you to Siwi for hosting the session. We really appreciate the support that you've given to allow this to happen. So Thank you very much. And I wish you all a good rest of your day, good afternoon, and a good evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.